So today I wanted to talk about imperialism, colonialism, and I guess I would call it like legacies of empires. So first of all, I wanted to compare, let's say, the British Empire and the Mongolian Empire. Mongolian Empire, of course, was land-based. It was a continuous empire. British Empire was sea-based. It was an oceanic empire. You can already see the cultural differences in how they administer. The Mongolians, of course, were famously brutal and savage, right? Killing, I believe, all the inhabitants of Baghdad, for example, when they declined. When I believe it was the king who killed off the messenger. You can correct me on that. But yeah, the Mongolians were very savage. However, they did establish or they reinforced the Silk Road, right, which led to a lot of trade all across Eurasia. The British Empire also was a lot of trade, right, maritime with South Africa, South Africa, Hong Kong, Singapore, I believe, and British Raj, and lots of other places, lots and lots of other places, Australia, Canada. But yeah, those are like the details, but I want to go more into kind of the implications. When it comes to the how a empire rules is largely determined by its culture, and its culture comes from its way of living, right? The Mongolian, of course, were nomadic steppe people, right? So they it was a lot less heavy-handed, right? They were much more religiously tolerant because they themselves were nomadic people, right? So they moved around, right? So that's why they didn't really establish huge centers of control. Obviously, there was the Yuan dynasty, right, which was an offshoot, or which was the Mongolian Empire. They became Sinicized, right? They became very Chinese. However, by and large, they were much less heavy-handed. Whereas, of course, the British, which were more feudalistic, right? Feudalistic Europe, and since they're an island nation, they were much more mercantile, were much more heavy-handed in levying taxes, right? Not necessarily religious proselytizing, but a lot more mercantile, right? Taxing, which of course famously led to the Boston Tea Party, etc., right, in America. Anyways, the how an empire rules is largely determined by its culture, and its culture is largely determined by geography, basically. Largely, it's not destiny, but it's yeah. So I wanted to highlight these two empires to basically get to the heart of my argument, which is the Mongolian Empire was much more direct in its conquering, right, in its violence. The British Empire, of course, also enacted violence, but it was much more indirect, right? It was a lot more thievery, right, and stealing. So it's the difference between basically white collar crime and violent crime. We usually, at least in the West, people think of violent crime, direct crime, as more heinous than white collar, indirect crime. But another comparison you can make is, for example, smoking, tobacco, versus wars in the 20th century. Tobacco killed way more people than all the wars of the 20th century combined, right? Combining World War I and World War II, Tobacco eclipses how many people it has killed in the 20th century. Uh, I believe the World Health Organization put out an estimate. Maybe 5 to 10 million people a year died from smoking tobacco. Of course, that's hard to actually calculate, but even conservatively, let's say 5 million, right? Times 100, right? That's 500 million people who died from smoking in the 20th century alone. That's conservatively. Like I said, it's hard to estimate. It's hard to calculate exactly how many people died from smoking because there's very lots of secondary causes. But because of that, we smoking killed a lot more people than all the wars of the 20th century combined. However, in history, we look at the wars more than we look at smoking, right? Because smoking is more dispersed, right? It's more indirect, right? It's an indirect cause of death, whereas war is direct violence. Of course, you also cause damage to houses, buildings, infrastructure. But this is basically the crux of the argument, right? The direct violence more better or more worser or better than indirect violence, right? And that's very it's a very contentious argument. I'll put a new twist on it and basically say the cultural perspective on it is completely different. In America, Americans are much more prone to recognizing direct violence. Whereas in, for example, East Asia, indirect violence is much more acknowledged. People are much more aware of indirect violence. And that's because of the cultural context, right? Americans self-selected to Americans are people who wanted to be free from religious, economic, other types of other types of persecution. They wanted to have religious, economic, social, other types of freedom, liberty. And because of that, Americans self-selected to be much more uh, individualistic, right? They're much more self-determination and rugged individualism. Americans are much more of the Americans wanted to get rid of their cultural roots, right? And because of that, America as a culture is very individualistic, right? It's the most individualistic country, basically, because of the history, right? Because of that American history. And so, because of America's individualism, direct violence it's directed to an individual, right? You kill or steal or you punch an individual, right? Indirect violence is dispersed, right? It's much more vacuous, right? It's much more silent. So it's spread across a huge a swath of people. And because of that, for example, in China, right? China, very old culture, 3,000, 4,000 years of history. So China has that cultural, social root, right? It has that social, invisible social net, right? Built over thousands of years. And because of that, Chinese people are much more attuned to indirect, systemic violence because of that culture, right? Because of that social fabric. And so in China, that's why chaos is seen as people want an authoritative ruler to get rid of chaos, right? In America, it's the opposite. People want chaos to get rid of an authoritative ruler, right? It comes from the cultural history of these people, right? It doesn't, right? One isn't better than the other. The American way isn't better. The Chinese way isn't better. It's just a different way of looking at things. So because of that, right, There's a cultural values discrepancy, I would say, between America and China. Why am I talking about America and China? It's because it's the most important geopolitical point of our times. The most important. That's not to say other cultures, other nations aren't important. Of course they are. However, the most important is China and America, the relationship between the two, because they're the two most powerful nations on Earth. That values the cultural history. Um, there's not been a lot of people who've tried to bridge that, right? Bridge the culture between China, like the much more Confucian, filial piety. But these words, right, Confucian, filial piety, those are Western words of describing Chinese culture, right? They're not words Chinese people would use to describe Chinese culture. They're Western words to describe Chinese culture. Whereas I would say Chinese people understand American culture a lot more. Of course, obviously they don't understand it as well as Americans, but there needs to be talk, right? There really needs to be talk between Chinese people and American people, like cultural exchange, because any sort of tension, any sort of conflict between the two would result in devastation for the entire world. So why am I why am I talking about this? I would say it's like the classic difference between 1984 and Brave New World. Um, 1984 is about Big Brother. Big Brother, authoritative government, right? It's the classic idea of what Americans think of as authoritarian, right? Authoritarian fascism, authoritarian communism. Whereas Brave New World is actually the American dystopia, right? Because it's subtle. It's very subtle. It's very indirect, right? It's subconscious propaganda. Americans are much more attuned to 1984, right? Authoritarian control than to corporate propaganda, right? Corporate propaganda or the mythology of American culture, right? Which is why Americans are the fattest people in the world, or maybe the second or third. It might be Mexico right now, or Samoa. I think Samoa had like a 73%, 70 something percent obesity rate. But besides Samoa, Americans are the most obese people in the world. Why? Because Americans, like I said, are attuned to authoritarian control, but not attuned to corporate control, right? Which is indirect, right? That's why in America, in Western cultures, especially America, white collar crime is seen as less heinous than violent crime. But it's just you could make an argument that violent crime or white collar crime is more heinous, right? Because you're keeping your hands clean, right? It's almost like you're being a hypocrite, like an ivory tower elite, right? Looking down on the masses of people. This is another big cultural point. The West, especially America, is very puritanical. It comes from its Puritan roots, right? China is much more grounded. China is much more, dare I say, material, right? Not material in like a Marxist sense. Just material as in, right, it's like boots on the ground, right? Am I richer? Am I poorer? That kind of thing. America is much more idealistic, right? It's high-minded, very, very high-minded, right? Which is why America is much more acultural, right? Because it's people who've disrooted themselves from their culture, right? So they're rootless. Americans are rootless, right? For good and bad reason. And because of that, Americans are very much more mental, right? Like the Shining City on the Hill, right? Shining City on the Hill, Manifest Destiny, right? Americans are much more ideological, mental, rather an idea. They're much more idealistic ideas than Chinese people. Of course, China has a rich history of philosophy, right? Analects of Confucius, Tao Te Ching, lots and lots of philosophical text. However, the big cultural differences is America really has been blessed. America is truly the land of the blessed. Not the Native Americans, right, which were almost wiped out by smallpox, but the American culture today, right, which is pseudo-European, right, pseudo. America has not never had a huge famine. America has never had a great war on its shores, right? It's never been invaded or attacked. And besides Canada in like 1812, right? But it's never been invaded. And Americans never suffered a huge pandemic. Obviously, there was the Spanish flu, 19 during World War One, and of course Corona. But Americans never had a huge pandemic like the Black Plague. So Americans have been blessed, right? No famines, no diseases, no major wars. There was the Civil War, obviously, but Europe and Asia, North Africa, they've been devastated by famines, plagues, conflict. And because of that, they have that history, right? They have that certain lineage. So, to me, it's basically geopolitics is really about understanding people, understanding their culture, understanding their legacy, basically understanding what they want and what they're afraid of. That's it, right? If America really needs to come to terms with understanding people, America's high-minded ideals, right? That's part of American culture, but if all you focus is on ideals, right, idealistic visions of the world, right, you're never gonna get the truth on the. You're never gonna get a boots on the ground perspective, right? You're never gonna get that physical, the visceral perspective. America really needs to understand China and Russia and Iran and Saudi Arabia and all these countries, right? The EU. I'm saying America because America is the hegemony right now, right? If it was another country, it would be that country, but America is the hegemonic power in the world. America established the global world order right after World War II. And so America really needs to get its act together, right? I want America to understand people from different cultures, right? So that they can truly work together, right? So that we don't we don't end up in conflict or unnecessary conflict.